We don't have time to run focus groups. We'll just send out a survey and get the same information. That is absolutely not true, and I'm going to talk you through why that is. Hello and welcome to Engage and Thrive, also known as EAT, your coffee catch-up with me, your host, Taelon, where we will go through common problems and hurdles that come up in business, marketing and advertising and try and demystify them. I know firsthand how complicated and confusing it can seem with all the different acronyms and all the things to do in business. So let me try and help you be better in business. First things first, let's start with grabbing a coffee. I've heard this misconception far too many times when people are time poor and they feel like if they do the survey, it's just ticking a box of market research, got some answers and we're done. Just a myth bust is that this isn't an or situation, this is an and situation. So in reality, surveys and focus groups serve completely different purposes. One collects numbers and the other one gives you narrative. And if you're using this interchangeably as an or situation rather than an and situation, you're potentially collecting the wrong kind of data or completely misreading your audience. Just remember, when it comes down to market research, it's not about collecting lots of or lots of opinions or lots of feedback or lots of numbers. It's about getting the right type of information that your business is needing at that stage. As always, let's go through vocab. The first one being quantitative data with an N, and that is measurable numerical data that shows trends and comparisons. So typically these are also referred to as closed questions. It may be a yes or no, it may be a score of 1 to 5. The next one obviously is qualitative data with an L, and this is exploratory open-ended questions. So people call this an open question, and this reveals more emotion, motivation, context. There's a lot more flow, more creativity around a qualitative question. A survey, a structured form used to gather measurable responses from people. Like I said, this could be a yes or no, could be drop downs, could be a 1 to 5, whatever the scoring. Focus group, a small group discussion used to explore thoughts, ideas, reactions, feelings, responses, but in detail. Interview, typically a one-to-one conversation that reveals more personal, in-depth insights without having any group influence. Number 1, surveys. I love a good survey, questionnaire, whatever you want to call it. And these are great for really, if you're trying to get a light touch understanding and validation about certain things. So typically you would use this to measure structured data, satisfaction scores, so NPS scoring. We've spoken about this previously in an episode. The question that would come up is, how likely are you to recommend us to a friend? Or if you're trying to get someone's feedback about the experience they had, or even if you had menu items and you wanted to ask their feedback about different variations of a menu, an or situation of questions. Or if you have features, so you have a product or service and you're wanting to roll out new features and you want to understand which is a higher ranking feature that people want, and again you're getting their feedback. These ones typically you'll see if you've ever emailed them, it may be that people are offering a cash incentive, so a £50 Amazon voucher, or you have a chance of winning this, etc. The risk with obviously a survey is that you're only asking the questions that you've set out. So if anyone else has anything else to say or any emotion or response to a question you've asked, you don't know. And unless you've left a blank field to say anything else you want to disclose, which they may not, or they may have forgotten about their reaction to question 2, you're missing that opportunity to gather that insight and that data, because literally they only have an opportunity to select what you have given them as an option. So obviously if you're going to do questionnaires and surveys, there is the old school form in a paper form. You maybe sent it in the post, or you may give it to people when they're in your restaurant or your shop. If you're wanting to do it online and electronically, makes it a lot easier to collect your data, then you may use Typeform, Google Forms, SurveyMonkey, Jotform, and then you could use social media to actually run surveys and questionnaires. It's just a different way of thinking about it. So if you think of, for example, on Instagram, you could post something in a broadcast channel and people may use emojis to respond. You could use a poll in a broadcast channel. You could use a poll on an Instagram content as a post, on an Instagram story, on a Facebook story, LinkedIn polls, YouTube community posts. There's lots of different ways of running polls. Again, these are all closed questions. And another one that's obviously related to podcasts is on Spotify, you can also add polls to your podcast episodes. Number 2, focus groups. So I love running focus groups, and the reason why I love running focus groups is because it's actually this balance that you have to come up with in the situation and in the environment. So normally when you're going into a focus group, you've had to validate a lot of data beforehand and understand the cross selection of people that you've got. So if you're trying to get some data to represent your current audience or your future target audience, how do you get that cross-reference of people? How do you make sure it's a good balance? How do you make sure that the groups are not too big, not too small? Do you have a mix of backgrounds? And then before you go into the focus group, you've got some questions in mind that you would like to gather information about. It may be very similar to questions that you asked in your survey or questionnaire, but these ones, you're not offering them the answer, it's an open question. And then the challenge really comes is when you're in the focus group environment, the conversation will happen naturally, and obviously you want to encourage everyone to participate. And depending on the mood of the focus group, you may have some very dominant characters who are always answering, and even their body language can influence other people's comments and feedback. But then actually you also want to be able to steer and evolve the conversation and questions into other questions that you may not have thought of, but actually they raise good points, and that's really good information for you to gather and capture in feedback. So I find them a really exciting situation because you just never know what can come up. And the reason why I just love focus groups is because it's one of the most beautiful opportunities to observe qualitative data happening naturally, and the ability for you to get potentially so much more than you thought you would out of conversations and things that you've never thought of. One thing I would say that can be a challenge with running a focus group is making sure that you have someone who's independent to your business actually running the focus group. So then you don't have a vested interest, or you're purposely trying to steer the conversation in a certain way because that's the outcome you want. So a lot of times, especially if you're a business owner, I wouldn't suggest that you run the focus group and have someone. They could be close to you but not actively involved in your business. So make sure that they're impartial going into that focus group. So situations that focus groups normally suit is if you're in an early stage and you're exploring product testing or messaging or clarity or even flavor testing. If you want to test your brand and maybe brand colors, brand positioning, brand tone. There's definitely been focus groups that I did in London that were large corporations, and they were trying to do focus group testing against small brands in the food industry. And a lot of times you have to do taste testing of different products. Again, with focus groups, they can be cash incentivized. So you may say to people, £20 for an hour of your time, come to the focus group. Or it may be that people are just interested in giving their feedback as part of the focus group. So there are websites you can sign up to actively be involved in focus groups, and they normally set a brief about the type of demographic they're looking for. So you own a credit card, you live in Manchester, whatever the situation is for the brief. So tools that people may use to run focus groups, obviously in person, but then you may also use Zoom or Google Meets, so you can record the session and refer back to it. Obviously, it would be harder to record a session when you're in person. A lot of people get embarrassed or shy around having a camera. But then there's also things like Miro and Canva whiteboards, where you may be running a focus group and having a live interaction of people actually doing things or seeing things or upvoting things. You know, if you were showing color palettes or if you're showing brand messaging or whatever, people can actively be involved in a group whiteboard situation. Now, in a social media context, people may say they're running focus groups if they are having live conversations in a Facebook group or in a WhatsApp group or a closed group on Instagram. Again, you're having that interaction in a group environment. Or if you're running a Instagram, YouTube, TikTok live and you have Q&A. So if you were running the Q&A, you may be asking questions and getting your community and audience to actually comment live and send emojis and reactions and responses, and then you're reading those comments and evolving questions and thoughts around it. Again, it's just a different way of thinking of how to run a focus group and how you're getting that information. If you think about it and you're doing it as a live and you're asking questions and you're asking the audience to give feedback, again, it's a little bit harder to evolve that conversation that people would be having amongst each other, and then what comes from that. Going back to the point, as a business, what information are you trying to capture and what are you going to be using it for? And the final one, number 3, interviews. So these are the most raw, honest truth situations that you can do in. And like I said, typically one-on-one situations, you may potentially do two-on-ones. So if you have a reason to have a couple or a mother and child or a father and child, whatever the situation is, a carer and someone else, there may be a situation where you have a two-on-one. But this is where it's the most sensitive, it's the most in-depth, it's the most emotional. You can get really, really deep into topics and discussions. The only thing I would say with an interview environment is, again, it really depends on the interviewer and the interviewee about their vibe between each other. If you have someone who is an interviewer who may be more of an extrovert and more lively like me, and then you've got someone who may be quite shy and the interviewer is not reading the room and understanding to be empathetic to that person, then it could end up being that you're just getting closed responses to your interview. So even though you have all this time together and a one-on-one situation, if they don't trust you, then you're not going to get very good answers from it. However, having said that, in an interview situation, you typically get a lot more grit. So if there's something that potentially you're trying to get really in-depth feedback about and investigate about customer journeys or a product that you have, and you're really trying to understand why are you getting loads of returns or whatever the situation is, in an interview situation, you're more likely for someone to let their guard down and give you the full in-depth and the full run-of-the-mill story about everything going on. And again, the nice thing with an interview is you may have some questions going in that you want to ask, but depending on where the conversation goes, depending on how you steer the next question that you ask. Typically, when you would use interview situations, like I obviously said, if you're trying to investigate something, or if you're trying to create an onboarding experience and then tailor something to do with your product or service, if you're trying to reposition something, so brand positioning, and you've got a very specific demographic, or if your product or service is quite high lux, you may want to take that opportunity to spend the time and effort of having interviews because your customer base is actually quite small. So although interviews can be quite time consuming, they're normally the like gold nugget moments. But just remember, you need to make sure that it's the right target audience that you're using for the interviews based on your business situation and what you're trying to achieve. So tools that people may use when conducting interviews, obviously face-to-face, or again, you may use Zoom, Google Meets, and you may even also enable your automated AI to actually write meeting notes, because especially if you're in a one-on-one interview situation, you want to give your attention to that person. You don't want to be scribbling down notes, but you don't want to forget everything. And again, it might be awkward if you're wanting to record, they may not feel comfortable being recorded. Again, in a social media situation, people may say that if you're saying slide into my DMs and you're voice noting back and forth with someone, that's like having an interview. The only thing I would say is, are you actually having that full connection if you haven't actually blocked out that time to even have 10 minutes one-on-one with each other, and making sure that you have your cameras on. If you're just voice noting backward and forward, are you, the interviewer, and are they, as the interviewee, giving your full attention to those responses and really getting in depth? And can you read them emotionally through those voice notes? So again, just something to think about. So as a wrap up, not all feedback is equal. You need to have the right method at the right time. Remember, some will give you numbers and some will give you narrative, and you just need to know what is right for your business at that stage and what information you're trying to capture, and therefore what are you going to do with that information. So is it better to have quantitative data or qualitative data? Thank you for joining me for another episode of Engage and Thrive with your host Taelon, and see you next week.